Hi everybody, this is Mr. Williams. Today we're talking about story elements, the exposition, and then setting characters and narration. So where are we in the storyline? Right now we're in the exposition, and if you look at the storyline, this is the flattest part of the chart until we get to the end. The exposition gives us the background info we need for the story. And a way to remember this word, it's in the root. Exposition exposes us to the story and what we need to know, or it puts us in a position to understand what's going on in the story. So you might be wondering what counts as exposition, what counts as necessary background information. Well, there are three things we look at for this. One is the setting, one's the characters, and the last one's the situation. These items are essential for any understanding of the story, and I'm including that settings icon here because when you're playing a game or using an app, having those things set up at the beginning before you start is very important for your success with whatever you're using. Just like with a story, where we need to know this stuff before we get going into any major conflicts. For the setting, we need to know where we are, when the story takes place, and ultimately how long the story takes place over time. How much duration do we have? If it's a few days, a few years, a few minutes, that really affects how the story works. We'll talk more about this later. For characters, we definitely need to identify our narrator. Now in this video, we're not covering narration. There'll be a separate video for that, but knowing who's telling the story and how it's being told can greatly affect the story. The protagonist needs to be figured out, or protagonists, the main characters. And the antagonists, if we have them, they don't always appear right away, but sometimes we know pretty quickly who our antagonists are. Finally, there's the situation. What's going on in the story at a basic level? We need to understand the general premise so that we can figure out what possible conflicts could happen in the future. Especially if the genre is something like fantasy or horror or historical fiction, we need to make sure we have the proper background knowledge to understand and enjoy what's going to happen in the story. To help with this slide, I've created an example. Here are the first three comic strips for Calvin and Hobbes, which was made in 1985. I'm going to leave this up for a second so you can read it, but you should probably pause the screen, and then we'll talk about what happens in this comic. So let's figure out the exposition for that Calvin and Hobbes example, the necessary background information. First of all, for the setting, although it's only been 3 comics, I know that I'm at Calvin's house, both inside and outside the house. His town in general is going to be the majority of the setting for this comic, so his school, the outdoors, anything around town is fair game for this comic, and there'll be other settings as well in different strips. For the characters, we only have Calvin and Hobbes so far. They're the title characters and they're our protagonists. We do have an antagonist already. Like I said earlier, we're not going to always have one of these right away, and sometimes they appear later on. But Calvin's dad, the way he acts with Calvin so far, how he talks to Hobbes, or when Hobbes is being a misbehaving individual, that would be Calvin's dad as the antagonist. In our situation, Calvin has a best friend named Hobbes, a stuffed animal tiger who everyone else thinks isn't real, and that's going to lead to other conflicts down the road. So often identifying these things isn't really too complicated. These aspects of the story are meant to be quick and get people's attention, although they can change and characters can be modified, settings can change, the situation is going to change. But we have to ask ourselves, why are these items important? For setting, the setting determines possibilities in the story. For instance, the time period, historical events, technology, etc., really helps us with figuring out what can be possible. Looking at these pictures below, the one on the left, if everyone's driving vehicles like that one, that's much different than a vehicle in, say, 21st century. And likewise, in the right picture, if we're in the 24th or 25th century, things like spaceships and other technological advances could really change things. Furthermore, for historical events, if I'm reading a story way back in 1700, 1600, or even earlier, I might need to be familiar with certain events that happened, especially in historical fiction. Now, location also applies to history because certain places have different historical events and different elements. Likewise, climate could be a concern. If I'm in the Northeast, there's always the potential of snow, whereas if I'm in the South, hurricanes are a possibility. And cultures change by location too, and now cultures also change over time, but knowing about the cultural history of an area and how people are expected to act in society is very important. And all these things combine for something called mood. That's a very important word in literature. It's the feeling the work arouses in the reader. So when I'm looking at certain settings, I should expect to see certain moods or be ready for certain moods. So if I change these pictures quickly, there's a big difference between a birthday party and a graveyard. Those places have different moods, especially when one of these is a party during maybe the middle of the day and one of them is a graveyard at night. Places have different moods at different times, and we need to be aware of that as well. I should also note that mood can be played with. For instance, you've probably seen a horror movie that was a parody that was actually also a comedy. We also have sci-fi westerns and other elements as well. Mood can be changed based on the actions and the characters and how they interact with the setting as well. You have to picture yourself standing in that location, seeing what's going on, and determine how you would feel. Characterization is also important for exposition. The way our characters are characterized could determine a lot from what we expect from them. For instance, characteristics to watch out for: age, beliefs, values, and culture, hobbies and occupations, and personality traits, both good and bad. When I look at Calvin and Hobbes, for instance, age is very important here. Calvin's in first grade, so building a tiger trap, believing in an imaginary friend, whether or not you believe Hobbes is real or not, and general elements about his behaviors, the fact that he's being yelled at for being loud when he's supposed to be going to bed, and that he doesn't really have an occupation. His personality traits are a little bit sillier than we would expect from an adult. These are all important to this, and there'll be more characterization throughout the story because as more things happen in the story, our characters gain characterization. That's a sign of a good writing piece as well, that our characters should develop, but we should have a base idea of who they are, just like Hobbes, just like Calvin's dad, just like other characters that will be introduced in the story. Let's use one last example here with the fourth comic strip in the Calvin and Hobbes series. I'll give you a second to read the comic, and then we will talk about it. So in the fourth comic, we have a new setting, and that means we have to look at it again with the whole idea of the storyline in mind. And sometimes comic strips are short, but this will work well for just our example in class. For exposition, the situation is always important. What we can infer here is that Calvin just had a show and tell, and he needs to put his Hobbes away. He needs to put his stuffed animal back somewhere safe. Now with inferences, I can tell just from earlier in the first three strips that Calvin and Hobbes are really close. So Calvin's not going to want to put his best friend away somewhere else. And since Hobbes, as you can tell, seems to be real to Calvin, he doesn't want to put him in a locker where he could possibly suffocate. So that's some important details to note what's going to happen later on. We can even have guessed that if we didn't have the other three panels right in front of us, and that could have been useful for predicting. For setting in class, we probably talked about pre-reading activities, and in school we have a different expectation than at home. There's more of a serious mood, possibly a stricter mood, and we see this when Miss Wormwood goes up to Calvin and tells him to please put his toy away, show and tell's over. There are certain things that are expected here. Now I know that the location here is the United States, possibly the Midwest, and this was published and takes place most likely in 1985, although Calvin and Hobbes is generally meant to be timeless. It is good to know this stuff because, once again, no matter how much Bill Watterson wanted this to be a timeless cartoon, certain elements are going to change over the decades since this has been published, so we can use that to our advantage to identify what's going to go on. And inferences and prediction, I just said one of them, my apologies, but certain technology won't exist. We'll see things like blackboards here. We'll notice they don't really use the internet or cell phones. That's stuff that can really affect how this would have been made in 2016. And also, we could look and assume that Calvin's not going to like school based on his characterization. Now, this goes with the next section as well, but the setting itself is supposed to be, once again, strict and serious, and Calvin is not a strict or serious individual. The fact that we're playing symbols in bed in the last part, the fact that he misunderstands his dad and feeds his stuffed animal tiger tons of food from the fridge, and the fact that he builds a tiger trap with tuna sandwiches all play to the idea that the strict setting of school may not play to Calvin's advantages. Now the final part we have here is characterization. So we need to follow our characters and identify how they'll interact with each other as the story continues. So Calvin with Miss Wormwood is going to be an interesting mix, and we'll talk about that in a second. Miss Wormwood is professional and polite. We only see her for one panel, but this is her introduction. Calvin, Hobbes' best friend. He's compassionate, but he's also a cheater because he's trying to get answers out of Hobbes. And Hobbes, likewise, is Calvin's best friend. He may or may not be real, and he's clearly bad at math because 7 plus 3 is not 73. But this also implies that Calvin's bad at math, since at the moment we are looking at this panel, and in the first two we can see that Hobbes is probably a stuffed animal. Now, inferences and predictions. Calvin and Miss Wormwood will have conflict. If Miss Wormwood is professional and polite, and Calvin is a cheater, first of all, in class, but also he likes running around, setting up tiger traps, that could create a problem. And also, Calvin may struggle in school. Beyond the fact that he's thinking that 7 plus 3 is 73, he also does not like this format. He wants Hobbes nearby. His first instruction from the teacher is one that he's going to not agree to and try to change, and so this could be interesting for the comic. And this is where exposition is important. We need to take our time, take every detail, and just store it away somewhere, because later on an event will come into play that could go back to this information from the exposition. So good readers pay attention, they take notes, they think about what's happening, and every time something new happens, they go back into their catalog of information to figure out what's happening next. And hopefully you enjoy this video. Thanks for watching.